Welcome to the Reel Rematch, the podcast where we unpack Hollywood's twin films, sometimes cloned on purpose, sometimes by accident, but always in competition. Today's matchup, the Fedora formula, Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom versus King Solomon's Mines, two jungle-chasing, trap-dodging, treasure-hunting adventures from the golden age of pulp revival, released just 1 year apart. Which one unearthed box office gold? Which one still holds its cinematic charm? And which daring hero truly mastered the art of adventure? Jeffrey.
How are we, mate?
I'm well. How are you?
Good, thank you. Good.
Mate, we are doing Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom.
Yes.
And King Solomon's Mines. So 84 and 85, back-to-back, adventurer goodness.
Well, you say adventurer goodness, I hope with tongue-in-cheek, because let's be honest, one of them is goodness. The other one is, in all honesty, how can I put it? It's a piece of shit. I'm really sorry. Because, look, we all know that making a film is not an easy process. I applaud anyone who's gone through it and worked on a film set. We've both done it. We've been there. We understand the blood, sweat and tears that go into it. But when you see a film like King Solomon's Mines, you wonder, what was the point?
Look, full marks for trying. I guess I was half right. But you know what? King Solomon's Mines did give us the short shorts of Sharon Stone.
Yes. Well, the ever-changing short shorts of Sharon Stone, because I remember watching it and going, wait a minute, her shorts started at her knee, just above the knee, and then they finish like short shorts with a side split as well. How did that even happen?
It's hilarious. Like, they are so short and then they've got splits of the thighs,
yes.
Into the film. It's crazy.
Yeah.
It is crazy.
It makes no sense. But then again, a lot of this film doesn't. So anyway, where would you like to start?
Well, it's funny. I actually do remember seeing Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom in the cinemas, right? And, I remember, and I've always got a soft spot for this film. But, upon rewatch and then, reading some of the production stories and the inspiration behind it, whatever, my God, is it dark, right? I mean, we'll get into this in a little bit, but it's kind of crazy actually for such a beloved franchise, for two such, large commercial filmmakers, really at the peak of their powers, and Lucas and Spielberg, making a film that is just so dark, right? Yeah. It's insane to think they actually, came out with this. I mean, it came out 41 years ago, and even it came out now, even with a desensitized, audience to violence and extreme themes, and otherwise, I think most people would find it pretty dark, right?
I agree. Yeah, it's definitely obviously the darkest of the first trilogy, The original trilogy. Yeah, and I think it's obviously, as you said, we'll go into it later as to the reasons why it is, but other than seeing that Lucas at the time when he was working through the story had said he wanted to make this Temple of Doom similar to Empire. He wanted it to be the darker middle tale of the film. I think this goes far darker than Empire ever did. So,
I mean, it really does, right? So, look, let's talk about, again, here we are. I think this one's a little bit of one of the more clear-cut ones that we've ever had. But here we are, 84, 85. These would have been released, less than a year apart. What was going on? Was was one a rip-off of the other? Loaded question.
Loaded question. What would you like me to say? Yes. Fuck yes. King Solomon's Mines is a clear rip-off of Raiders, right? Obviously, Raiders of the Lost Ark came out in 1981, one of the greatest adventure films of all time. Everyone was riding the wave of these films and their popularities. And then you've got our friends Golan and Globus at Cannon Films, who famously did whatever the hell they wanted to. And so they took the original Alan Quatermain King Solomon's Mines novel, written by H. Rider Haggard, and decided to turn it into this adventure tale that was their version of Raiders of the Lost Ark. To basically, in really simple terms, I mean, although again we can't quantify this, cash in on that wave of adventure films.
It kind of falls under that category called mockbuster, right? Films that quickly mimic blockbusters to kind of, trick or entice audiences to go see them. I mean, there are so many clear steals or otherwise. Richard Chamberlain obviously is the key character as Alan Quatermain in King Solomon's Mines. I mean, he's dressed very similarly to Harrison Ford, right? You've got, sort of the two market scenes. Obviously, you've got the one in Indiana Jones and Raiders of the Lost Ark. It's meant to be in Cairo. You've got the one in King Solomon's Mines that's meant to be set in, I think Morocco, in Casablanca specifically, very, very similar. But then also really similar that they both shot in completely different locations. Like you've got, the Raiders scene, I think, was shot in Tunisia, and the sort of like the scene for the market scene in King Solomon's Mines was actually shot in Zimbabwe. So it was all like a rip-off upon a rip-off. And they're both trying to be these exotic locations in North Africa, yes. And then they both go to kind of like cheaper locales, to actually film the scene. But I mean, just so much about it. I mean, there was, the fact that you had, these two films come out, I think it was one of those things that were really, really popular in the kind of like the 70s, 80s, started to die off a little bit in the 90s, I think to a lesser extent. And Canon Films, pretty much, made their mark by doing these kind of like cheap knockoff mockbusters, right? I mean, the Missing in Action, franchise, just a rip-off of, Rambo. And, they were extremely successful. I mean, they had a really good formula in terms of super low budget, Ape, a well-established, much-loved property, and otherwise make it on the cheap, spin out a couple of bucks, rinse, repeat, let's move on to the next one, right? It was all good until, the wheels, fell off. But, yeah, obviously, I think one of the most obvious cynical cash grabs, clear echo of Raiders in structure, style, and tone. And I use style and tone very loosely in that regard. Been very charitable to King Solomon's Mines there, but it's interesting to watch these two films side by side because they really shouldn't be.
No, definitely not.
But in terms of other comparisons and otherwise, say from one film to the other, do you recall? And I know you're probably trying to scrub the memory from your brain and your ocular sockets, but do you recall, the scene that's kind of got that crazy witch doctor at the end of King Solomon's Mines? There's kind of like a lava pit. Everything's really got a really, really strong red light and otherwise.
Yes.
And it really has that callback to Temple of Doom, right?
Yes.
Where again, you have the shaman or the witch doctor or the guy who's almost like the sort of like the devil incarnate or otherwise, having that ceremony again across the lava pit and so on and so forth. There's a lot of echoes of sort of the films together. And it's funny, echoes upon echoes. It's even though it's very different, you've got, that scene where, again, a crazy, culturally insensitive, super racist scene and otherwise where they're, cannibals are either, people in Africa are either spearjuckers, cannibals, basic tribes people or otherwise, and they've got that huge pot, and the key ingredient's going to be, Quatermain and Sharon Stone's character. When it starts rolling down the hill and otherwise, which kind of has echoes of, the big boulder kind of rolling down and about to flatten Indy, but then strangely has echoes of Indiana Jones and the Crystal Skull, funnily enough, with the thing rolling down the hill. And it's like the fridge, after the nuclear explosion, sort of rolling down. I don't know, but it's funny how films kind of fold in on themselves. One rips off the other, which rips off the other, influences the other otherwise. So there's a lot of that, throughout, and then some of the more and I use this term, loosely, the wistful scenes where you have, there's people in the trees who come down and they grab Quatermain and Sharon Stone and then, look after them and, to do a little bit. So there's those elements of whimsy that you've also seen a lot of action films when it is getting a little bit too dark or heated or otherwise. But, the whole concept of, this peril and this kind of tropical or sort of exotic location, very clear rip-off of both Temple of Doom and Raiders for King Solomon's Mines.
Oh, it's so clearly, I mean, even the fact from the story, the original King Solomon's Mines is set in the 1880s, right? It's about an adventurer, again, because he's British, which Richard Chamberlain is not, right? They don't try to make him British, which is fine. He wears a pith helmet, very British headwear back in the day, not a Fedora-style hat. But also that Canon Films and Golden Globus, when they did this, transported it to World War One so that you would have Nazis as the bad guys. But that was we won't make it World War Two, similar to Raiders. We were prepping for, this is, we'll say World War One, where the Germans are still bad. And in this case, the Germans are bad because they're just atrocious, as in actors. Sorry, but it's just really, really bad, So I don't, I don't know what next.
So I mean, it's true. I mean, look, I haven't seen King Solomon's Mines since, I was a kid in the 80s. right?
I don't think I've ever seen this film prior to watching it for us.
Strangely, I actually have a much fonder recollection. But again, this is like, sort of, like my preteen self, I think, when I saw both of these films, I've seen this and the sequel, Alan Quatermain and the City of Lost Gold, which came out, I think, the year after, right? And I have much fonder recollections, obviously, the sort of like the fog of time, like 39, 40 years later, right? Thinking of what these films actually really mean to me. But, fonder recollections of the films and what they really are. But again, like, you think, as a, sort of like preteen or otherwise kind of watching these films, and it feels close enough to whatever. And like, you haven't really developed that analytical side of your brain otherwise. And it's action, it's adventure, there's like a heroic guy. There's, sort of like, really attractive kind of like female lead. There's imminent danger. There's booby traps. There's that, German imperialism and the Nazi element, like in the other ones. Like, so there's enough there as a young kid to think, oh, this kind of feels like a, comfortable pair of shoes. Right?
Yes.
So, without really knowing it, you just kind of go along with it. Rewatching it was like, well, that's probably the last time I think I'm ever going to watch King Solomon's Mines.
I can't say I'll ever watch it again after this. I'll be honest with you.
So, hey, let's get into some of the film. Like, run the numbers, Jay.
All right. So here the numbers go. So Temple of Doom came first. Peak summers period, May 1984, took 25.3 in its opening weekend with an ended up domestic run of just shy of 180 million. Overseas, it did another 153.2, so it ended up with about 333.1 million. As you said the last time we spoke, one of the only first 4 sequels to ever pass 300 million at the box office. It was the second highest grossing film of 1984. Do you know what was the film that beat it?
In 84?
Yep.
Tell me.
Ghostbusters.
Oh, wow.
The top 5 films in 1984 were, for the box office, number 1, Ghostbusters, number 2, Temple of Doom, number 3, Gremlins, number 4, Karate Kid, number 5, Police Academy.
Police Academy
was the 5th highest grossing film of 1984.
What a year.
So with a budget of 28 million, Indy brought home nearly 12 times the budget for the studio. All right?
Just incredible.
Then you get on to King Solomon's Mines. Opened it just over a year later in November of 1985. It took $5 million at its opening weekend and then went on to finish with $15 million. That's it. I couldn't find any mention of international box office at all. I'm sure it was screened at some places, but just not enough to actually report on. There is no international box office figures.
And again, I mean, the thing about sort of like canon films, they're almost, set up for video and like, cable TV and rewatch and otherwise. So they would have made a ton of money, I assume, at the back end.
Well, what that does say is, I mean, the only thing to mention is it was number 1 at the box office in the week it opened. Obviously, mustn't have been a lot showing at that time.
Yeah, quite weekend.
So the budget was apparently $12 million. Now, I couldn't try and work out because they shot this and The Lost City of Gold back to back.
Right.
So I don't know if it was 12 million for the single film or 12 million for both films.
And you know what, Jeff, I'm going to just hit the pause button just briefly there. Like $12 million, you know what? That's not up on screen, right?
No.
But whereas 28 million, I think he said for Temple of Doom, that's up on screen and then some, right? And I think that's the amazing thing about Spielberg. Like for the most part, he's been pretty judicious in his use of money and otherwise. And I think is, kind of like a Clint Eastwood type of director who's famed for kind of coming on time and on budget. Obviously, there's a couple of exceptions like Jaws and otherwise, but you see every dollar of that 28 million up on screen, right? Where King Solomon's Mines, if you had told me it had a budget of 5, I would have believed you.
Yeah. So that's the only thing with that budget is I'm not sure if again it could be that 12 covered both.
Right.
I do read somewhere that Canon Films did make money off these, so they must have worked it out, probably with video sales, probably with the way things are, pre-sales, so on and so forth.
Got it.
In terms of reviews, statuses, 2 very differing opinions here. We're going from decent praise to complete shitfulness, is what I've written. So Temple of Doom, as of now, sits at 77% on Rotten Tomatoes, 7.5 out of 10 on IMDb, and has a number of 57 on Metacritic, which is a bit low, but again, I think the darkness of this film doesn't do it any favours. Right? King Solomon's Mines has one of the lowest Rotten Tomato scores I think I've ever seen. Do you know what it was?
15%?
8%.
Single digits.
It has an 8% Rotten Tomato score.
Outstanding.
5.2 out of 10 on IMDb, but sits at 29 on Metacritic. So it's still got something in there anyway. With audiences, obviously Indy is always rated high and is known for what he is. So it's 86% on the popcorn meter, whereas King Solomon's Mines is at a lowly 31%.
Right.
So I think we can clearly see the difference between how these 2 films have been appreciated over the last 40 years.
It's not really worth asking who had the better legacy question with these two films back to back.
We already know the answer to that before we even get to that question. So I think
hashtag rhetorical.
It's interesting though. If you talk about legacy though, I reckon if you talked about legacy with people, I think it's almost like the legacy of Indiana Jones is Indiana Jones.
Yeah.
Right? We all know who Indiana Jones is, right? And for our generation, we know those first three films, right? Raiders of the Lost Ark, Temple of Doom. We call them Raiders of the Lost Ark, Temple of Doom, and Last Crusade.
Yeah.
We don't mention his name because for us, it's just they are Indiana Jones.
Yeah.
So I think that's the legacy for him is the actual name, the character in a sense.
And, you know, I love rewatching Temple of Doom. As I said, it's always had a soft spot, so for me. And there's a couple of things that I really, really do like about the film. It is a bit uneven. And I think it gets too dark for its own good. And I think you'll talk about that a little bit more. But, you know, for me, bar none, like, you know, Raiders is, you know, the best action adventure film of all time. Just hits it out of the park and then some. Like, it's such an incredibly well-made and well-crafted film. It's like the way I feel about, you know, Back to the Future. A lot of people say that, you know, in terms of like, you know, story setup and payoff, it's one of the most beautifully crafted, like, you know, stories or films that, you know, has ever been, you know, put to screen or put to paper or combination of both. And like Raiders for me is like the perfect action adventure film. You know, many people have tried to ape it. No one's really come close. And watching Temple of Doom, there's elements of like brilliance in there. It's just not as good. And like Last Crusade as well. I mean, I still remember seeing Last Crusade. I think because films used to come out like 6 months later, sometimes longer in Australia after they were released.
Back in those days, we did have to wait. Yes.
In the US. And I remember actually seeing this when I was in year 7. Our whole class went to go see, like, you know, Last Crusade. Absolutely loved it.
Yeah.
Right? Really, really, you know, sort of like pleasing. I think really benefit from the addition of Sean Connery. I think that really kind of like helped really make the film, kind of like carve it as something a little bit different. I love the fact that they both try and go after the same woman in that film. Like, that's kind of crazy. But, you know, you get away with that shit in the 80s.
Yeah.
But you know, but again, like, you know, I love watching Temple of Doom again. It was a pleasure. But then it reminds me of how much I actually really love Raiders. Like, because like Raiders, again, like I've seen Temple of Doom more than I've seen Last Crusade because I've got a softer spot. And like, but like, you know, I would have seen Raiders, you know, 10, 20x to what I've seen the other two combined.
Totally.
Just because I think it's just close to a perfect film.
I remember many years ago, and this is showing that I've been around for a long time, McDonald's gave away all three as a trilogy as a giveaway for buying some certain meal on VHS sometime in the late 80s, early 90s.
Wow.
So, and we had those, and between my brother and I and my family, we wore those tapes out.
Yeah, I bet.
So, yeah, cheap cardboard covers, not the old school plastic VHS, but, you know.
And I think, the great thing, I think that the term Hollywood use is kind of like a 4-quadrant film where you kind of like pretty much appealing to each kind of like key, you know, sort of like demographic.
Yeah.
And the Indiana Jones films are just that.
Yeah.
They really are. Like, they just like hit all the marks. And that's why they're kind of like stuck with me this time, rewatching it and kind of analysing it in a way that we, you know, don't generally when you're watching a film just to enjoy it, is, yeah, the darkness and the tone of the film was quite surprising because that would have put, I guess, some people off, like at least rewatching the film or otherwise, and probably why it hasn't maybe stood the same test of time and isn't as beloved as Raiders or Last Crusade, to be honest.
Possibly. Absolutely.
So let's dive into the directors, Jeff. So I'll kick off with Indiana Jones and Temple of Doom. Our boy. I think everyone's boy, really. Like, the greatest filmmaker of the last 50 years.
Absolutely.
Is that unfair?
I'm not going to argue with that at all.
Like, I mean, you know, he does Raiders of the Lost Ark in 81, E.T. in 82, this in 84, The Colour of Purple in 85, Empire of the Sun in 87, and then Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade in 89.
Yeah.
What a decade.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, and it's kind of great. He's still making amazing films to this day. Like, and I guess the other thing I also want to shine a light on, we don't usually do this, but I thought this is important because, you know, Spielberg, almost unlike, I think, a lot of other filmmakers of the past 50 years, has really built a solid crew that he doesn't really rotate in and out of much at all, right? And this film, you know, has actually had a few people who've rotated in and out. But in terms of the behind-the-scenes talent and capability, amazing. So he's got the triumvirate of George Lucas, Frank Marshall, and Robert Watts returning as producers, and Kathleen Kennedy joins the troupe as an associate producer, right? Fuck me. I mean, like, you know, just like as stewards of the film of guidance, I mean, just it's just incredible, right?
Yeah.
You've got Douglas Slocum, who lensed Raiders. He comes back. You got Michael Caine, who cut Raiders. He returns. And then John Williams, who scored Raiders, also returns.
Yeah.
I mean, the behind the scenes talent is arguably better than the in front of camera talent in this film. It's just remarkable.
Yeah.
So let's jump over to King Solomon's Mines. So J. Lee Thompson, right? So Jeff, I think you were telling me like he was like 70 odd.
He was 71 when he made this film. He was born in 1914, 71 when he made this film. Right. He began directing back in 1950. All right. So he came post-war. He became a director. He was very well known for some films that probably even beyond our generation that we're not known for. He's other than, and I know you'll talk about some stuff he's done with Cannon. He's most famous for the original Guns of Navarone film, which was a classic World War II film. He directed the original Cape Fear.
So that's like 61, 62 back-to-back?
Yep. He did McKenna's Gold, which I remember was a well-received film in the year. He did 2 Planet of the Apes films when they were popular, Conquest of the Planet of the Apes and Battle of the Planet of the Apes.
72, 73.
Yep. And he actually worked a lot with Gregory Peck back in those early days, who I found a quote where Gregory Peck said, "There are only 4 directors in the world that I trust to tell me if I am failing in my performance. Alfred Hitchcock, George Cukor, William Wyler, and J. Lee Thompson." Right?
I mean, that's some high praise.
Yeah. So this was, I think, coming to this point, again, you're 71 years of age. I know there are guys like Spielberg now. Let's take Clint Eastwood, who's still directing at the age of 95, and directors who keep going, Ridley Scott, some of those guys who keep going, who's still up there in the upper echelons of great directors.
Yeah.
But there are some directors who keep going who have reached the top of their peak and now are on their, let's say, downward stretch of life.
That's their best before date.
And I think he unfortunately had becoming to that point. Right. So I even read that the reason Richard Chamberlain signed on is because of J. Lee Thompson.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So the only other film that I wanted to throw in, because I thought 72, 73, obviously the 2 Apes films back to back, he also did Huckleberry Finn in 74.
Oh, there you go. Yes.
Right. And like, I've really got faint memories of that because, again, I saw it when I was, preteen. Fond memories. Who knows if I saw it now? I feel like King Solomon's Mines. I don't know.
Yes.
But again, like he had a pretty solid career, right? And like real workman-like director, high praise from, a Hollywood legend in Gregory Peck. What I found was really interesting as I was drilling into the research here is that obviously King Solomon's Mines, like we discussed, was released by Cannon Films. What is fascinating is there was 11 films that J. Lee Thompson directed in the 80s. 9 of those 11 were for Cannon Films.
Really?
So he directed 9 films for Cannon. Let me just quickly list them for you. 10 to Midnight in 83, The Evil That Men Do in 84, The Ambassador in 84, King Solomon's Mines in 85, Murphy's Law with our boy Charles Bronson in 86, Firewalker with Chuck Norris and Lou Gossett Jr. in 86, Death Wish 4, obviously Bronson again in 87, Messenger of Death, again Bronson in 88, and then Kinjite, Forbidden Subjects in 89.
Wow.
Right? So he literally holds the record for the most films directed for Cannon Films, which I think is amazing, right? So he really kind of like shaped that kind of like their grittiness, maybe sort of like the sort of like the cheapness, and really quite sort of like simplistically brutal and visceral films that Cannon made through their halcyon days, throughout sort of like the 80s, right? But I just found that incredible. Like, I think the next person who directed the sort of like the most Cannon films probably tapped out at 4, right?
Yeah, right.
This guy's done 9. So, I mean, I felt that was like a real fun fact. I don't know if they signed him up, for some, hey, give me a 9-picture deal or something like that, but it's kind of crazy. Like, that's
maybe because he'd done the first couple and he was on board, they're like, we'll just keep going back to J. Lee Thompson because he's a workhorse and he'll get the job done.
Because you know what, he'll work with whatever scraps we throw him, and and he'll produce something that we won't feel overly horrible about. And usually will make us a little bit of coin. So
exactly.
Why not rinse repeat, right?
Yeah, exactly. So that's really that was really interesting that you found that fact. That's amazing. So, I mean, even looking him up, it looks like Kinjite was almost like his last screen credit. I mean, if he was 71 doing this in 1985 or 85 when this came out.
Yeah.
Dude was 75 when he made the last Kinjite film.
I mean, solid career.
Yeah.
I mean, but what was probably directing for like 50 years.
Yeah.
I mean, it's incredible. And like, it's got some absolute bangers in it. And like we've already like spoken about in the past, like sometimes you're lucky to have one.
Yeah.
In in the filmmaking business. So, solid for him. Interesting way to see out his career, but everyone's got to eat.
Well, yes. I mean, I think admittedly, even Richard Chamberlain was quoted as saying the reason he did this was signed on was because of J. Lee Thompson. But then he realised as he was going through that he was just going through the motions.
Right.
He was at that point, I think, in his career. Maybe he was tired, maybe he was. Who the hell knows? But he was just literally going through the motions. Yeah, cut, action, not too badly, but let's get it done and dusted and get the hell out of here.
Classic.
Yeah.
So let's talk about some of the in front of camera talent. Right?
Yes.
So we'll start off with Temple of Doom. So, I mean, we're talking about runs, right? Now, Spielberg had a run.
Yep.
Hold My Beer says Harrison Ford, right? I mean, he's got Empire Strikes Back in 80. He's got Raiders in 81, Blade Runner in 82, Return of the Jedi in 83, this in 84, Witness in 85. Holy shit. Like, what a start to a decade.
That's awesome.
Has anyone, maybe except for Arnie in the early 90s, has anyone had a start to a decade as amazing as Harrison Ford?
I wouldn't think so. Potentially. We'd have to really look up to see who that would be.
We'd really have to do some work. So, but I mean, he's like, up there in the Pantheon. I mean, he'd have to be, sort of like that top 5. If maybe not top 3, but so Kate Capshaw, she does this in 84, plus she does Best Defense with Eddie Murphy and Dudley Moore, and Dreamscape in 84. Like, what a year for her.
Wow. Okay.
Right, so busy. She does Space Camp in 86, Black Rain in 89, Mary Spielberg in 91. So, I mean, she had some kind of like run, kind of like, mid-80s to sort of like early 90s, both personally and professionally. And then the film debut of Ke-Huy Quan.
Yes.
I hope I'm pronouncing his name, who then appears in Goonies. Like, what a 1-2 combination as kind of like a young actor. And like, it's obviously this was his film debut. There was an open casting call that was put out to all elementary schools to find a young Asian actor to play Short Round. Quan apparently just rocked up with his brother. And it wasn't to audition. It was like there's moral support or otherwise. But he won the role over like another 6,000 people actually went for the audition. And like, I mean, it's amazing. Like 1-2 films, he does like 2 iconic films that came out in the 80s, more or less kind of like disappears. And then, a couple of years back wins Best Supporting Actor.
Yeah. Yeah.
At the Oscars. Like,
yeah. But
what an amazing career arc.
He went off and became a stunt guy.
Oh, really? He was a stunty.
And worked a lot with the name eludes me, the stunt team who did The Matrix.
Oh, really?
The martial arts guys. So he worked with those guys a lot and learnt the stunt trade. So that's why he does a lot of his own stuff and everything everywhere all at once.
Right.
And all those couple of films he's done since then, where there's that action film he did last year and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, that's to keep going in the industry. That's what he started doing.
Well, it's interesting. Well, I mean, again, like, what an amazing performance. Like, I think it's an incredible debut. He's perfect in this film. I mean, like, I personally think he's perfect in Goonies as well, to be honest.
Yeah.
But just like great kid actor. So let's jump over to King Solomon's Mines.
Yes.
So you've got Richard Chamberlain. Had some career, really did, right? So he was in the TV movie Count of Monte Cristo in 75.
Yep.
The TV movie The Man in the Iron Mask. Were they both Dumas books? Like,
I think Monte Cristo is, but the Man in the Iron Mask is essentially, I don't know if it's Dumas, but it's very similar. It's a very similar story.
Yeah, it is similar. But he was also in the TV series, the original, Shogun.
Yes, which I think is one of the biggest things. That was what he was very popular for back in the day and very well known for.
So that was 1980. He was also like in this huge miniseries. I remember like my mum, my grandma and so on and so forth, they were massively into it, called The Thornbirds.
Yes.
In 1983. Then he does this. In 85, its sequel in 86, right? And then you've also, I don't know if it was introducing, but it was kind of like close to a film debut of note for Sharon Stone. She does this in 85, the sequel, Ellen Quatermain, The City of Lost Gold in 86, Police Academy 4 in 87, Action Jackson in 88, and then Total Recall in 1990. So, really kicks off kind of like her career really with this steaming pile. So good for her. And then we've got John Rhys Davies. Obviously, Connective Tissue with Raiders of the Lost Ark, which he did in 81. He does this in 85. He does Firewalker, also directed by J. Lee Thompson, with Norris and Gossett Jr. in 86. And he does The Living Daylights which I know you got a fun fact on a bit later on with Timothy Dalton, his first film in 87. So, in all fairness, like on paper at least, you think like really, really like solid cast.
Yeah.
There's actually, if anything, a bit more gravitas, and otherwise with the King Solomon's Mines cast.
Well, even
on
like
paper.
Herbert Lom, who's Colonel Bochner, the crazy German guy, he was in Casablanca.
I mean, it's incredible. I mean, like that's what I'm saying. On paper, there is some bona fides to the behind the scene and the in front of camera, like sort of cast and crew, I guess, for this film. So
yeah.
It wasn't like they were, short on talent.
Don't forget it. Oh, Herbert Lom as well was also the chief inspector in all the Pink Panther movies.
Of course.
Yes.
That's actually where I knew him from. I was trying to place him.
Yeah.
Right? That's incredible. So
as you said, the depth, almost like the depth of character actors in King Solomon's Mines is almost deeper than what's in, no offense to those guys in Temple of Doom, but you know what I mean?
But it's true. And it's like that for those big star vehicles. Like usually there's like one main actor and they're offsider. So this one happens to be the romantic interest or whatever. And there's more of a bit part role played by Short Round, who isn't quite comic relief or otherwise, but I think for want of a better term, maybe kind of like plays that role in Temple of Doom. But yeah, I mean, like there's some serious talent on King Solomon's Mines. Unfortunately, they weren't maybe given the right material to kind of like work with, and maybe more energized, interested director maybe could have made a little bit more out of what they did have.
Well, it's almost like we have that question we occasionally ask, which is in the alternate universe question: what happens if things were reversed here? How would Temple of Doom been King Solomon's Mines?
I mean, here's the thing: like you can't, you can't separate Harrison Ford and the character of Indiana Jones.
No.
Like, him as Han Solo and him as Indiana Jones, like two of the most iconic films in film history, right? And Harrison Ford just brings that that sort of like roguish charm, right? But then the cerebral nature to the character, as required as an archaeologist, in a way that I don't think Chamberlain could. Like I think Chamberlain could do the archaeologist component or whatever.
No.
But in terms of like being like highly desirable and kind of like lust after by his students, and and then also as a believable hard nut action guy. He's a great actor, but he's just not that guy.
No, I agree totally. I think, and that's part of what Harrison Ford brought to the role.
So what I could say though is Sharon Stone could have been Kate Capshaw in Temple of Doom.
She actually tried out for it.
Are you serious?
Yeah, she apparently auditioned for the role and was considered for the role of Willie Scott at some point.
Because I think she would have been like, seriously, you know what? Like, no offense to Kate Capshaw, Sharon Stone would have been fucking awesome.
Yeah,
like I love Sharon Stone, and I think she's like underutilized talent, and she came in this like hyper masculine kind of somewhat misogynistic 80s and 90s in Hollywood, where it's just like egos and cocaine and and a lot of bullshit, right? Yeah. But she's a serious talent, some of the films I've seen her in, and otherwise like she's amazing, right? And in all fairness, like you look at her role in this and Kate Capshaw's, and Kate Capshaw, I think she got a lot of critical arrows. So more bricks and bouquets for her performances, really, which I don't necessarily think is her fault. I think it's more the script in defense of her. And in the elements, the role that she's playing with, what she had to work with, I think she's actually okay. Right? But Sharon Stone in such a shitty film, she's actually iridescent. Like, I was like, oh my God, her performance is amazing. It's not, but she's captivating. You can't take your eyes off her. And I think she gives a real, a real sort of, articulated or realised performance, given the context and, material that she was working with.
Yes, fair enough.
Right?
Oh, no, I agree. Yeah, again, Willie Scott as Sharon Stone as Willie Scott would have been, again, different film. Yeah. Different dynamic, I think, from what's between Indy and Willie in the version we know. But yeah, it would have been really interesting to see it.
But I mean, like, the best thing that Kate Capshaw as Willie Scott does is really that start of the film, that musical number. Like, she's sensational in that music number, and I love how she jumps between Mandarin and English, and the way that she's presented and she's lit, and the dress, like, and then. Just that sort of set scene where, kind of like things go to hell, where, the bad guy says to Indy, he starts to hold up that little blue vial, and he goes, and Indy's like, what's that?
Yeah.
He goes, the antidote. To what?
Yeah.
To the poison you just drank. Right? And then shit just goes haywire. Like there's someone shoots someone, whatever, and then it's just on, right?
Yeah.
And then I love how they contrast that scene where, the antidote flies up on the floor, the diamond that Willie's trying to get flies up on the floor, right? And they're both chasing those various, like, MacGuffins, as Lucas will call it, sort of, throughout that scene in different ways, and like, everything, usurps them or kind of prevents them from realizing, that their goal of attaining that object. Like, the ice goes through the diamonds, you can't see the diamonds anymore.
Yes. He's
just about to pick up the vial at the end, and it gets knocked by someone dancing. And like, that scene is staged so perfectly, but it's all set up so perfectly as well. And I think Capshaw in that scene, she's phenomenal. Unfortunately, I don't think she's given as much material to work with first.
No, I agree. And yeah, that's the thing. And there is, recorded history that she spent a lot of time learning how to do the song, the dance, and everything to do with that scene. Like, she went all in to get it all learned. So yeah.
Look, it is incredible. So let's if we think about some real life inspiration. I mean, you mentioned that the King Solomon's Mines is literally based on the H. Rider Haggard novels. And if I look at Temple of Doom, it's been I think really well socialized over history, that the influence that Lucas had was just the pulp serials and jungle adventure tales, and drawn, I guess, some additional elements of this film from Indian folklore and otherwise. So really interesting sort of like background in terms of real life inspiration. There's not really much. I mean, there's just stories to be enjoyed by an audience, right? They are sort of like works of fiction, but there are some really interesting kind of production things. Over to you, Jeff, to sort of like take us through some of the things that you uncovered.
Well, it's interesting. So obviously the use of voodoo in this film is quite prominent, with the young Maharaja, using the voodoo doll to limit Indiana Jones's movements, and obviously it was very prominent, particularly in that last battle scene with the giant guy that he overcomes. So there was a lot of stuff to do with voodoo back in the 80s across TV and film. So I think it, to do with the supernatural nature of it and the way it works. So you've got, The Believers in 1987 with Martin Sheen. Child's Play, technically not, it is, but the soul transfer spell is rooted in voodoo that gets Chucky into the doll.
Yep.
You've got The Serpent of the Rainbow, which is probably the biggest direct voodoo-inspired thing. Scary as Hell film in the late 80s from Wes Craven. Tales from the Crypt had an episode of it. Scooby-Doo obviously did voodoo at some point. There's even an episode of the A-Team that has a criminal gang using voodoo to scare people. So it was just that Hollywood thing in the 80s of using these mysticism and supernatural things to do these kind of...
And let me throw something else. And I know it came out, like Predator 2, Jeff, 92?
Yes, Predator 2.
Or was it 90?
90 or 91, actually. Oh, well, yeah. But I know, Predator 2, very big voodoo influence. That was one of the gangs.
Yeah, again, like you had also the Rastazares, and there was really strong kind of like voodoo. I mean, like
even James Bond.
But yeah, like...
Live and Let Die, that was very strong with the Haitians 100%. And the voodoo. So it's always been Hollywood has always popularized and used that voodoo. I think the whole thing about the doll with the spirit that you touch it, stab it, move it, do it, and that makes the person do that, which is a big story point inside of Temple of Doom as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great sort of, device. It's intriguing. I think, Hollywood's always leaned into mysticism and, things of exotic nature and otherwise. And, it's interesting as well, because then you sort of like, take that right through to sort of like the 90s and beyond. I mean, it's still going. Like, see things like, The Craft, right, where they've got witchcraft in there, and even most recently, where you've got, films that, are going on, be it sort of, the urban legend films based on urban legends, or, other films now that are about a single urban legend and making films about, like the film that was made by those two sort of like young Australian fellows, right? There's that person's hand, or, whatever they clasp, and, so it's always been a device.
Yes.
In Hollywood films, but yeah, it had a real run.
Yeah.
In the 80s.
Definitely. I mean, look, starting in the 70s with the mid-70s all the way through to the mid to late 80s. So 15 years of solid, I'm not saying voodoo hasn't been there, but obviously they used the influence of voodoo and what it did to people and the mysticism and the supernatural nature of it.
And then also early 90s, right, I think after Predator 2, then you also had The Prodigy, the voodoo who to what you don't dare do people.
Well, maybe they watched a lot of films and figured that was the best way to do things.
Yeah, 100%, and actually, funnily enough, harking back to Temple of Doom and King Solomon's Mines, if I recall correctly, the video clip for the Prodigy's voodoo people was like they actually like running through a jungle or something.
I'm pretty sure they are. Yes, you're right. See, it all ties in.
It all ties in.
There's always tying in.
So some other like notable facts and otherwise, like there's two things that I want to call out. So going back to sort of like 84, the rating system never had a PG rating, right? And what's really interesting is like, both had Steven Spielberg's fingerprints on this, but both this film, Temple of Doom, and Gremlins, which both came out in 84, led to the creation of PG-13 rating, right? It was pretty controversial at the time as well. They had to create a whole new rating to try and get these through, because they don't have the same rating system that we have in Australia, where we've got like, we had like M and MA or whatever. They never had that. So they had like G, PG, R, right? But
they didn't have PG. It was literally G or R.
But yeah, they didn't have that. But their R is like our MA.
Yes.
Right? And then I think they had X or non-rated or whatever, right? Where we had, maybe a more sort of a liberal sort of classification system. So they developed a whole new rating for this. And, a lot of people thought this was really controversial at the time. Like we talked about how dark the film, a lot of people thought it was too violent for a PG film, but again, it wasn't violent enough for an R. So it was kind of in that liminal space or in between. And, some films felt that both Gremlins and Temple of Doom would have been rated R if someone by the name of Steven Spielberg hadn't been attached. Who obviously had an outsized influence in Hollywood, not just at the time, but still now. But apparently there was a change. This change had been planned by the MPAA, so the ratings board in America, as early as 1977. But really, Gremlins, this film, and strangely, The Flamingo Kid, also in 84, came out, got a PG rating. Flamingo Kid was actually the first film to actually get a PG-13 rating.
There you go.
But all these things kind of like at the time, they just thought, hey, let's actually, develop this whole new thing. And then Red Dawn was actually the first film to be released with a PG-13. Flamingo Kid was the first film to receive the rating, but apparently it sat on the shelf for 5 months before it was released.
Right.
But obviously, there was something in the water in 1984 where they're introducing new films for new audiences. And I think this is because, the baby boomers obviously is having so many kids. There's kids starting to come of age. And Hollywood didn't make a lot of films like that historically for, young kids, young teens and otherwise, right?
Yeah.
And then they started making all these films and there was too much of a gap between a G and an R is what I'm imagining. And, hey, let's introduce this new one that created this whole new category of films that could be, sort of like put in that classification.
Well, it was this is part of it. It was almost a necessity. As you said, the MPAA had been discussing it since at least the late 70s, so the story goes. So it was definitely, it was needed. You can't go from a G to an R. There's too much grey area in the middle.
Oh, yeah, no way. I mean, it's a big jump. So other production thing that I've got a few things, but one thing that I've got is, Temple of Doom was actually the first film to use THX's theatre alignment program, which ensures that cinemas showing the film meet stringent technical and presentation standards.
Oh, really?
So obviously a little influence there by George Lucas, but I thought that was pretty incredible. But the other thing that I also got was during production, the film was starting to go over budget, and Spielberg went to the writers, Willard Hugh, and Gloria Katz, and asked them to make changes to the script in order to save money. They removed one page from the script and saved $1 million. And it was a planned air chase scene using vintage biplanes, right? The scene was removed from the film and later incorporated into Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade.
There you go. Well, that Willard Huck and Gloria Katz weren't the first screenwriters to be offered this. It was offered back to Lawrence Kasdan to write it because he wrote the original Raiders. But he himself said it was too dark. He didn't want to write it. It was too dark. So that's when Lucas went to Willard Huck and Gloria Katz because they'd written American Graffiti for him back in 73 or whatever that was.
Actually, I've got a quote from Kasdan to your point, Jeff, where he goes, I just thought it was horrible. It's so mean. There's nothing pleasant about it. I think Temple of Doom represents a chaotic period in both Lucas and Spielberg's lives, and the movie is very ugly and mean-spirited.
Well, I think we've both found like we've both said it's dark, but I think we've both noted in talking before we started recording that both Lucas and Spielberg were going through dark times in their own personal lives. Lucas was going through a divorce at the time. Spielberg had just broken up with his longtime girlfriend, and they both just wanted to take it to that dark state because that's where they were, I think, in their own lives. So, potentially it was that they were in that frame of mind. I mean, again, we can speculate. Maybe they were in that frame of mind. They couldn't see beyond their own inner turmoil, let's say, to see how dark the film was, We just don't know.
So, funnily though, as a study in contrast, Quentin Tarantino said that this is actually his favourite movie of the franchise.
Really? There you go.
But you think for him, he loves like grindhouse films,
Yes.
Sort of like, gritty, grimy, dirty, and otherwise. So the fact that he likes this film maybe isn't overly, like surprising or controversial or otherwise. But
Yes.
yeah, no. So I thought that's super interesting.
Yeah.
So you kind of led with, the voodoo dolls and how that became a bit of a popularised trope, throughout the 80s. I've got another one for you.
Yep.
Quicksand.
Quicksand.
Now, this is more from King Solomon's Mines, right? There, Sharon Stone's character gets trapped in a sinking swamp pit, right? It's not actually called quicksand, but it functions in the same way, right? The characters gradually, sinking while screaming. It's all happening in slow motion, right?
Yep.
Now, like, this had this kind of like crazy run for at least a decade, right? Probably a little bit longer than that. But like, let me hit some highlights where quicksand had a very prominent role in films. And I've tried to contain it a little bit, but Never-Ending Story in 84, right? There's Artax, which is Atreus' horse, tragically sinks in the swamp of sadness, right?
Yep.
And again, it's not quicksand per se, but, for all intents and purposes, it's functionally the same thing. Blazing Saddles, you've got Sheriff Bart and Jim get stuck in quicksand while building a railroad. In The Black Stallion Returns in 83, there's a desert set quicksand trap. In The Princess Bride in 87,
yes,
Wesley and Buttercup fall into the lightning sand, which is a fantasy version of quicksand. For all intents and purposes, it's the same thing. 1984, Romancing the Stone. Again, Kathleen Turner and Michael Douglas' character encounter a boggy, muddy swamp, which again functions like quicksand. And then, you've got a film that also came in 84 called Sheena, where the titular jungle heroine confronts swampy terrain and near-death entrapments. Again, kind of plays like that. And again, it's kind of like one of those, symbolic perils, cheap thrills. It's tied to pulp and adventure. And it's also like, probably like pretty cheap to film and otherwise. So it's kind of like real nice bang for buck, very simple trope. It kind of started to die a pretty quick death in the early 90s and parodied, a whole heap, became very cliche and passe and otherwise. And, CG started to take over with, obviously more menacing, elements of danger and otherwise that they used to use in these adventure films. But Quicksand had a moment.
Yeah. Okay, that's cool. Well, I also just similarly rock crusher deaths.
I love it.
You know how there's the scene between Indy and Mola Ram's henchman, and he gets pulled into the rock crusher. So there was a similar death to that in The Living Daylights in a couple of years in 1987. He gets tangled into the net and pulls into the cargo plane's engine, and you've got various bits and pieces like that. Similar themes in RoboCop, Total Recall, especially with a lot of the rock crusher stuff on Mars, Terminator 2 with the crushing and bits and pieces. All those kind of things happened.
Also in Die Hard 2, where McClane's having that fight on the baggage carousels sort of up behind the scene.
Yep.
And that guy gets kind of like crushed by sort of like the carousel. So, no, again, not quite apples for apples, but very similar, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, there was a thing about...
But even in Die Hard 2, when he gets stuck when he's on the wing and he fights the black guy, and he gets kicked into the engine, but he's stuck because he's stuck on something and it pulls him into the engine. Same thing.
It kind of like gets...
same thing, similar to what happens in Living Daylights. So,
yeah, it's really interesting how they use this kind of like industrial style, death as a mechanism. I mean, again, it's highly cinematic, right? It's really visual. People get it straight away and they understand, the danger or the peril or otherwise. So, yeah. But no, I think that's a great shout and a great catch in terms of...
And then famously made fun of in The Incredibles, where the villain Syndrome, who starts off at the beginning of the film as a hero to the main guy, Mr. Incredible, who always says, don't have a cape. Capes are dangerous, you don't need them. At the very start when he's about this big and it moves to 15 years later and he's the supervillain Syndrome.
Right.
And at the very end of the final battle, because he's wearing a cape, he gets sucked into a jet engine.
Oh, classic.
And he's like, been telling him for years. Right?
That's standard.
So, comes full circle.
No, so I think it's great that we've got, kind of like a couple of, seminal moments in terms of, trope development or otherwise coming out of these two films.
Yes.
I mean, there's a couple of other things, right? So maybe not as obvious, right? But the use of colour, right? So towards, the end of Temple of Doom, right? This is pretty much the final showdown where they're at the bridge, right? You've literally... you've got, the bad guys, which are the thuggy cultists, loyal to, Mola Ram. The colour scheme, these are like, red sashes, robes, headbands, and otherwise, right? And then on the other side of the bridge, you've got the good guys, which is the British Indian Army, right? And the colour scheme is like light blue turbans, and so on and so forth. Now, this became, I think, a real thing where they started to play around with colour really as a motif to signify, good, bad, good, evil, and so on and so forth. The one that struck me straight away as the parallel, also released in the 80s, was Big Trouble in Little China, right? So that came out in 86, I think, if I recall correctly. I could be wrong on the year, but the alley fight scene at the start of the movie?
Yes.
So again, the bad guys for the Wing Kong, right, their colour scheme was like red headbands, sashes and the like. And the good guys, the Chang Sing, colour scheme was blue shirts, vests, yellow headbands and the like, right?
Yeah.
And, I just love the fact that, they started to use these motifs to signify what was going on. So intuitively, you just know as an audience. So where red became weaponized visually, and blue, sometimes with yellow gold accents, were seen as rational, honourable protagonists, usually defenders of order and tradition, and otherwise just really classic visual storytelling. Yep. And these techniques were replicated, time and time again, right? And they did a bit of a variation or riff on that, obviously in the 90s. We used to get the contrast between kind of like the orange and the blue, and sometimes they used purple, right?
Yeah.
And stuff like that. But the choices, I think, really started, kind of like in the 80s, and the fact that you had, almost like these again, another trope that was developed and just continued and played one for, the next X amount of decades.
Yes.
So,
yeah.
Quite incredible.
Yeah. Okay. I don't think I'd pick that up with regards to the colours.
So, got a couple of other things as well, Jeff, but I think we're starting to get into maybe, some sort of like fun fact. But before we get there, I did want to remark, I guess, on this whole, aping kind of of movies and themes and otherwise. Obviously, we've talked about, the cynical cash grab that King Solomon Mine, really was, this mockbuster that it was meant to be and otherwise. Yep. What was interesting is that there really was this huge cycle. Obviously, Raiders kicked it off, right, and popularised it, and everyone wanted to cash in. King Solomon's Mines wasn't the only one, right? So, in the cycle of films that were kind of this, Indiana Jones, / afternoon matinee adventure mold, and so on and so forth, there was actually a whole heap of movies that came out that were similar in nature. Like, in, I guess, chronological order, you had, The Hunters of the Golden Cobra in 82, you had Treasure of the Four Crowns in 83, Motherlode, in 82, Nate Hayes in 83, you had Romance in the Stone in 84, you had Jewel of the Nile in 85, actually you had a Tom Selleck film which is like High Road to China in 83, River of Death in 89, Sky Pirates and Jake Speed in 86, right? And obviously King Solomon's Mines and Alan Quatermain, City of Lost Gold, 85 and 86 respectively. So I know I bounced around there kind of like year-wise, but this is kind of like, again, a real thing where, one popular element spawned the whole heap of kind of like copycats and otherwise to try and kind of like cash in on the success of.
Yeah.
And we've seen that time and time again. It's probably less so now in the age of streaming, but
yes,
hugely popular in the 70s, 80s and 90s.
Yeah, and I think, as you said, obviously Raiders brought it to the fore, right? Probably became super popular off the back of that. And then, people rode the wave for the next 5, 6, 10 years.
Absolutely. So, let's get into something else. I mean, look, I don't know if it's production related. I don't know what category do you want to put it in, but I've got a bit of research on Sharon Stone in King Solomon's Mines.
Okay.
I don't know if you do or not, but first of all, a fun fact. So, one of the producer, Menahem Golan,
yes,
allegedly he actually wanted Kathleen Turner to this, right? She was obviously coming off Romance in the Stone, which again is pretty much of
the same film,
the same nature, right?
Yeah.
And he allegedly said, "I want that Stone woman."
Yeah.
Obviously, lost in translation, they got Sharon Stone.
Yeah, I found it, but ironically, the other side of that is that they offered her, Kathleen Turner, $1.5 million to play the role.
Right.
So you've got and again, I saw the same fact, is that, he said, "Give me the Stone woman," so they cast Sharon Stone. But there's also another story that they offered Kathleen Turner $1.5 million to come and play the role of Jessie. And she turned it down because it was too similar to Romancing the Stone.
Right. Well, good point by her.
Which of those is true? I don't know. Let's just say the fun one sounds a lot more humorous.
So a little bit more about Sharon Stone. Apparently, she was pretty rough going and not a great person to be around on the set of King Solomon's Mines. So allegedly, she was frequently at odds with cast and crew, right?
Yep.
She was viewed as entitled and someone maybe he shouldn't have been as entitled so early in their career. She was pretty difficult, demanding, and temperamental. Clearly frustrated, apparently, by the chaotic sort of like production.
Yeah.
And was really kind of like disliked on set. Whether it had much of an impact to her career or it was more of a stumble and otherwise, who knows, because it worked out fine for her. But she clashed even with like Chamberlain, right? On set, and Chamberlain was very diplomatic about it and called her, very ambitious and experienced. But the implication there was that, she was a challenge. She was a handful.
Yeah.
She was also like frequently questioning direction, wardrobe and scenes. And, again, for someone so early in their career, pretty uncommon to do so. But, upon, viewing, maybe she was right. Maybe she was actually, the voice of clarity and truth, questioning J. Lee Thompson for his direction or maybe lack thereof, right? Apparently she had a real temper. She wasn't, shy of, confronting anyone on set. She had a little patience, just about some of the chaotic sort of like nature, and was pretty public and consistent about her feelings.
Yes.
She clearly was not a fan of the grueling conditions, that took place on location in Zimbabwe and Kenya, heat, insects, general discomfort, which was probably like pretty hard to hear from the rest of the cast and crew who were in exactly the same conditions. So, again, Chamberlain, he wrote a memoir in 2003 called Shattered Love, right? And just said that, look, she was very hardworking, but she was difficult, right? And he was seeming to suggest that some of her behaviour was, probably stemming from, her ambition and drive to try and prove herself in a very male-dominated, rough and tumble film industry.
Mm-hmm.
And, some of the insecurity she had about maybe trying to overcome that. And then, like based on things that I've heard or read about Sharon Stone and her experience in the industry, that actually tracks, right? She didn't have a great time of it. I think she has articulated some of the things that she used to bump up against. And she was clearly no shrinking violet. She was quite happy to use her voice, right?
Yeah.
And what have you. Obviously, it's not fair or otherwise. There was huge power imbalances sort of back in the 80s and 90s. But, good on her for kind of like standing her ground and doing that. And, it's interesting what history, can do, to the overly complaining, vocal, sort of like, female lead of this film.
Yeah.
Would actually be seeing more of a, sort of like truth telling in someone, depending on how they're presenting themselves and otherwise, and someone who is quite happy to be assertive and sort of like call out, BS or inappropriate behaviour or, when things just didn't feel great. So, it would be interesting, like, it'd be very hard to say because you can't jump into a time capsule or time machine or otherwise, but there was certainly, I think, probably an element of her just, standing up for what she saw as right and maybe at the time not being sort of like viewed, maybe as she would be viewed today, she was, doing the same thing.
Probably. I read that because she was so difficult to work with, there's a story, I don't know if this is true, the crew played tricks on her, mean tricks on her. And one of them is that they pissed in her bathtub in her trailer and she didn't realise until she stepped into it.
Yeah, that's rough.
That it had been done and she caught the smell. So that was pretty bad.
Yeah, I don't love that.
Yeah. So, yes, maybe she should have got the Indy role. Would have been a bit different with the Willie Scott role.
Yeah, I mean, like, there's practical jokes and abuse, right?
Yeah.
And, but again, like, that wouldn't have been an isolated incident, especially back in the 80s in filmmaking, again, male-dominated sets and the like. So
absolutely.
Kind of sucked, but I'm glad that, things have started to change, certainly for the better.
Yeah.
Hey, so let's get into maybe some other, aspects. It's interesting about, we talk about the darkness and otherwise, and I think you've gone into detail about, the pretty, challenging personal times that both Spielberg and Lucas were going through. It's interesting that, upon reflection, Spielberg, said that, and he said this in 89, he wasn't really happy with Temple of Doom. He thought it was too dark, too subterranean, and much too horrific. He thought it out-poltered Poltergeist.
Wow.
Right? And then he actually went on and said, there's not an ounce of my own personal feeling in Temple of Doom, right? And he said that it was his least favourite of the trilogy.
Yes, I read that as well. Yeah.
So, I think it's really interesting for him to, and that's, I mean, like, in 89, like, it's kind of like been a hot minute, in the overall scheme of someone's life, 5 years later, him sort of like making those remarks and comments. But again, I think it's, like an odd kind of like curiosity and interest in addition to, his film canon and otherwise. And it's not like, he didn't cover himself, with a whole big glory. And look, the thing is that about Temple of Doom, unlike a lot of his other films that have got really great shots, Temple of Doom's got some great scenes, right? Like, the sort of like the mine, when they're in the mine carts and the scenes there and the chasing, and even the scene which is one of the most brutal scenes I think I've ever seen, where, you've got that witch doctor shaman guy who literally rips out that guy's heart, right? It's about to be sacrificed. The heart cavity seals itself. The heart is still beating in the shaman's or the witch doctor's hand, right? They then strap that guy in the cage, and then when he's prone, they flip the cage over so he faces the lava as he's slowly lowered into the lava. So he's kind of like seeing his impending death slowly kind of like creep upon him. As he gets closer to the lava, the drums start beating faster and faster, right? The heart actually catches, sort of like flame.
As he does.
And then the shaman, laughs, maniacally, right? Like, look, it is super extreme for a PG film and like really intense, but what an amazing scene.
Yeah.
Right. There's no one shot in there, but it really does have some amazing scenes. And you know what, like the start of the film, right? Literally feels like a James Bond film, right? Like, you have this kind of like, amazing setup that doesn't really tie to anything else like a lot of Bond films, sort of like did. And then they're in that plane, right? And then the guys jump out of the plane and they have to, like do in some fantastical nature, like escape from that sort of like, plane. I mean, it's incredible. And apparently, Spielberg, he really wanted to direct a James Bond film. But as you know, like they didn't, choose any director that wasn't British.
Yeah.
To direct James Bond films until 2021, where Kerry Joji Fukunaga directed No Time to Die, right?
Yes.
So it was great, like Spielberg kind of having his James Bond moment, and it really felt James Bondy to me when I was watching it. And again, like no one great shot, but a great scene or sequence of scenes. So yeah, it's just incredible.
Yeah. Well, originally, I mean, just as a production side of things, so yes, I had some of that data as well. So this was originally due to shoot in India. So they had planned to shoot the whole thing in India, given the Indian storyline behind it, right? But when they went to the Indian government and showed them the script, they rejected it because they didn't want to have anything to do with the thuggies or the thuggee cult because they'd essentially wiped it out.
Right.
So they took permission away and they weren't allowed to shoot in India. So all the Indian scenes are shot actually in Sri Lanka.
Oh.
And they used matte paintings back in the day as they used to make the rest of it look like India.
Right.
But most of it, there's a big, large chunk of it was shot in Elstree in London.
Oh, okay.
So they shot most of it in Elstree studios. Apparently, for the bug scenes, which were all shot in London, for the bug scenes, crew members would go home at the end of the day, strip themselves down, and still have bugs on them. Apparently, for days and weeks afterwards, they were finding bugs throughout their kit, throughout themselves, just bugs and bugs and bugs while they did those scenes, which is quite interesting. But otherwise, production went pretty... Harrison Ford actually had to have surgery for a herniated disc because he... in the palace fight in the bedroom when they have that sort of they're getting together scene and they storm out together and then will he come back, will he not? And she's waiting for him and she gets angry and he's fighting the guy in his bedroom.
Right.
He suffered a severe disc herniation during the fight scene. Oh. Struggled on for about 5-6 weeks. They literally brought a hospital bed onto set and he would lie down between takes as he kept going.
Oh, really?
Until they realised we just can't keep going on like this. And so he went off and got surgery and fixed. And Vic Armstrong, who was his stunt double, spent the next 5 weeks they did a whole bunch of stuff with him.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. And Vic Armstrong's wife was Willie Scott's stunt double. So,
really?
Yeah, so they did that stuff for the next 5 weeks.
Oh, apparently. Nice. Yeah. So nice little sort of like parallel.
Yeah, absolutely.
Enable the continuity, the show must go on. So that was great. I mean, you talked about the Indian government kind of, walking things back and, it really stuck out to me when I was watching it. Pretty insensitive, one note, quite racist kind of portrayal of a culture. I mean, especially obviously the banquet scene, right, where they're eating these ridiculous, like inhumane sort of foods, like live snakes, beetles, monkey brains, and all this other sort of stuff. And apparently that was a lot of people over time and otherwise really took exception, and rightly so. Yeah. And also the inappropriate use of the word Maharaja, right, like because again meant to have quite strong spiritual sort of connotations and meaning sort of like in their culture, as are like the portrayal of Kali as a demon rather like a deity and the god of empowerment and change, right? And and also just the basic depiction of, for the most part, like they're just savages or simple tribes people and otherwise. So pretty problematic, sort of like when it sort of came out, hasn't aged well, right? But again, like not dissimilar to King Solomon's Mines, where you've got that ridiculous scene where, you know, again, like sort of like the cannibals, you know, sort of like are there and they're either spear chuckers or basic tribes people. And like, you know, it's just, it's a pretty one-note, horrible depiction of, you know, people effectively aren't white, right?
Yeah,
It
exactly.
wasn't great. Aged pretty badly.
No, it hasn't aged very, very well at all, right? So, you know, throughout that entire sequence, yeah, same thing. So a lot of the crew actually on King Solomon's Mines were Israelis and South Africans.
Yeah, right.
Which caused a lot of objections from the local populations because they were also depicted as slavers and or cannibals, basically. So that was one of the big complaints from the film.
Yeah. Look, I mean, let's kind of like just get into maybe some final thoughts, maybe some things that we liked and otherwise.
Yep.
Because I think we're kind of like rounding out towards the end here now. But, you know, I love how kind of like 1930s Temple of Doom is, and nowhere more where you've got Short Round, you know, saying to Willie where she's trying to wake Harrison Ford or Indiana Jones when he's in the plane. The plane and the two sort of like, you know, Chinese pilots have, you know, parachuted out, and then she's going, Mister, and she's trying to wake him up. And Short Round says, he goes, "You call him Dr. John Stahl," right? It just feels so 1930s, and I think is really sort of like well executed. There's an awesome kill where I think, you know, one of the Indian henchmen sort of come into Indiana Jones's room. You know, they're having this fight, and they sort of punch in on, and then Indy like bullwhips him, whip wraps around his neck. He throws it up to the fan, and then it tightens and like strangles a guy. Great kill.
Yeah.
Well done.
Yeah.
Right? And there's also some really nice kind of like parallels in the film. Like, and it was interesting you talked about the two stunt doubles for, say, you know, for the male lead and the female lead in the film. There's also that really nice moment where Indy's getting whipped by that sort of a big guy. The Maharaj is whipping Short Round.
Yes.
That's like the
comparison scene.
It's just a great little scene.
Yeah.
I love that. There's going back to King Solomon's Mines now, there's a scene where Quatermain navigates, you know, from one side of the river to the other, is on the stepping stones, which kind of feels, again, kind of ripped off of very like what happened in Last Crusade.
Yes.
Moving towards the Holy Grail. There's also like the roof with spikes at like 1 hour and 22, which is literally just a direct rip-off of Temple of Doom.
Yeah.
In King Solomon's. I thought that was great. The other thing about King Solomon's Mines is that I reckon, and again, this is towards, you know, the last third of the film, towards the end there, is that it is the worst or some of the worst special effects or most fake flames or fire I've ever seen.
Oh,
right?
yes.
Where he's fallen in the mountain. And it's also the least lookalike stuntman of an actor that I think I've ever seen committed to film. So well done for them for some of the worst of awards. Some of the other things I just want to call out, and I'm almost done, is how the Paramount logo is integrated to the actual scene in both the Indiana Jones films, right? So in Raiders, the Paramount logo mountain, like literally kind of like fades or is integrated into the mountain in the background.
Yes.
That's there. I love that. Just so awesome. One of the best transitions ever.
Yeah.
And then in the second one, the Paramount Mountain kind of dissolves into the mountain that's on the gong with the symbol that is then struck by someone in the nightclub, right?
That was great.
It's like, fuck yeah.
Yeah,
You know, it's so well done.
Yes.
And then, of course, it would be remiss of me not to note that the nightclub at the start of the film was called Club 81.
Of course. Yes. One of the big Easter eggs that everyone's mentioned.
Exactly. So the other thing I've got, Jeff, is that apparently last year in 2024, Indy's whip and the 3 Sankara stones from the film sold at a heritage auction for a combined $625,000.
US? Or doesn't say?
I assume it's US, but didn't say.
Wow, that's awesome. That's so cool.
So look, there was a lot there. I think that was a lot of fun. It was clear who the winner was and kind of like where the
yes. We honestly know what the hell. A couple of it's just these are chalk and cheese films. Do you know what I mean? Like, you've got classic, legendary, 2 great filmmakers, yes, making probably the darkest film they've ever done jointly, but still an adventure ride. And then you've got the blatant rip-off that is just, you know, atrocious from the moment it starts until it ends, right? There are gaping story holes. There are gaping things in there. You spoke about the stunt double being not even close to Richard Chamberlain, which is very evident in the chase scene through the market when he's jumping on and off the truck that they steal.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Yeah,
like, you can just see that's not even close to being Richard Chamberlain, right? So, which John Rhys Davies actually in an interview at some point pointed out that he was surprised no one was hurt because apparently they barely had any stunt doubles. So they did a couple of the big scenes, like you're talking about at the end and in the beginning, but the rest they all had to do themselves, all their own stunt work, because they were like, oh, we don't have safety guys or stunt guys. You jump off that train or you jump here.
Yeah, just sign this disclaimer first, please.
So, yeah, I think it's very easy to see which film we prefer. I think it's very easy to see which film is better. I think it's very easy to tell which film we will likely never revisit again.
Absolutely. So, Jeff, you won't be racing out and watching Alan Quatermain in the City of Lost Gold?
I think I'm going to take that off my Amazon next to watch list and go and watch something else. So
hey, talking about watch list, nice segue.
Yes.
What are we doing next episode?
Well, we're going to go a bit dark again, I think. We're going to look into some Cold War nuclear issues. I think we're going to go and revisit The Day After and Threads. So very, very interesting twist on what we've been looking at before. Hopefully not as... well, maybe traumatizing us in a different way rather than the atrocious filmmaking, maybe just in their messages. So, interesting one to look forward to.
Well, it sounds like it's going to be pretty heavy. I'll make sure that I'll bring in flowers, some soft plush toys, and some party poppers and sparklers to kind of like bring a little element of levity and joy
Sounds good.
to that episode. But until next time, Jeff.
Thank you, mate. Talk soon, Justin.